You are listening to E-Radio Show
by Missed Apex. We are electric.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is called Tachita Mockingbird. Sam Bird, that is. And let's say hello right now to our very special guest, well, our very only guest, Chris, no longer _ Stevens. How's it going there today, Chris?
It's going great, Matt. We've just had such a busy weekend over at Missed Apex Podcast doing the Simply Race live sim event where we live streamed it, and we had such a great time there. Doing a live show recording there, as well as the Australian Grand Prix race review on Sunday. Yeah, it's been a busy weekend.
It's starting to feel a little bit like you're trying to rub it in. But before we go on, I need to remind everybody we are an independent podcast hosted by MissedApexPodcast.com, bringing you race reviews, news from the paddock, and tech analysis. We live stream our race reviews, so be sure to subscribe to E-Radio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our live chat room as well. Well, speaking of well, shall we get directly to it? We've got a new race coming up this week, and it's in a place called Sanya. Where on earth is that, and what do we know about the venue thus far?
Well, the Sanya city, it's a southern city in China, and it's hosted right on the beach. So it's kind of the new Punta del Este, if you like. And it seems like some of the teams are already, quite happy with the services provided out there. And I got to say, there's a bit of relief about this race because it was quite late getting everything going for it. I think until quite recently, there were still doubts about whether this race might even go ahead. But everything's been resolved and the race, is happening 100%. So we haven't got to worry about that. And it seems like it is actually going to be quite a nice place to be and to watch some racing.
Well, that's fantastic. And now it's being a resort beach area. You mentioned Punta del Este. Do we expect to have similar issues with complete and total lack of traction due to sand and all the other sorts of excitement that were provided? And have you seen the circuit? I mean, how do we think this circuit is going to play out compared to some of the other ones we've seen thus far this season?
I don't think it's going to be as big an issue as it was in Punta del Este because it is a little bit further away from the beach, I think, going from the aerial shots. But we won't really know until the venues all put up and we actually start racing there because, of course, the only thing we've had to go off of at this point are the simulations, which we know can only be so accurate. And I'm sure we'll find several teams coming to the track and finding actually we had this corner a little differently. Yet the road surface is very different here to what we had in the simulator, and they'll have to compensate accordingly. So I think a lot of this race is going to be down to, the pre-race preparations and the simulator specifically.
Yes, well, I can personally say, based on my extensive simulator preparation for my track day at Silverstone, that, yeah, there always are a few teeny tiny differences between sitting down at a computer and then doing it live. But more importantly for the racing, who are we tipping for pole? Who has the momentum? Who has the hot hand? What have you heard? What's going on?
I mean, who doesn't have a shot for pole, really? At this race, we have the potential to make it 6 different pole sitters from 6 different teams and 6 different winners from 6 different teams. The contenders so far are Nissan E-Dams for the win. We've seen them going really, really strongly in the last couple of races, and for one reason or another, it hasn't come together. Mexico was, very obvious. Santiago, Buemi could have won that race had he not crashed out. Hong Kong, Roland got really, really unlucky with the events that happened there. For pole position, we have Audi. They haven't claimed pole position yet. Lucas de Grassi technically didn't in Santiago, although by rights he did by quite some considerable margin as well. And then for both, we have DS Tachita, who haven't got a pole position, who haven't won a race this season. And I find that really, really staggering, as I'm sure many people do. They were tipped to be the favorites going into this season. So for their home race, maybe this is the right time.
Well, I'm sure fans of Jev and Andre would be delighted if they were able to pull off such a thing. But let me ask you about that real quick. It's a marked contrast to the previous season where consistency ruled the day. We've had big regulation changes, but more importantly, I think for Techeetah, we've also changed and they become a manufacturer, no longer taking the was it the Audi powertrain that they had,
The Renault.
the Renault powertrain. And is this just to be expected, no matter how seamlessly the handoff was between the two projects?
The thing is, the car is quick. It just is quick, and we know that, and it just isn't coming together. So much of Formula E is defined by the actual events that you take in the lead up to each race. So your pre-race preparation, as I mentioned, weekends like this in particular, where it's a new venue and nobody really knows what to expect. But even with a circuit that you're very experienced with, like at Hong Kong, for example, things can still be thrown up in the air because you have such limited track time as well, that you have to nail it from lap one on the circuit. You've got to get the setup right immediately and not make any kind of mistakes. If there's some failure on the car, we've seen that in the past where just fixing some issue throws something out of balance, and then suddenly your weight balance is illegal, or something's now overweight or underweight, as it has been in the past. I mean, just ask Lucas de Grassi, he lost a win that way. There's so many little details that can come between a car being fantastic and going off and winning the race and having all that taken away from you. So the car is quick. We know it. They will win a race this season. I will be staggered if they don't. But I feel like there's no better place to come here. And we saw Andre was very, very quick in Hong Kong. So he's going into Sanya with a point to prove, I think. And Jev really needs to get back, towards the front. He's had so much bad luck in the past few races. Hong Kong was a real low point for him as well. They've got to get back up there.
Yeah, they do. And you're right about the performance of the car, but it's the performance of the team that I was curious about. Just having a new power plant, having new procedures to integrate into something that must have been very second nature for them by the time they got into season 5.
Well, the team has done a good job. You can't blame them for what happened in Adria, really, where it was the fact that they only had 15 minutes of running before qualifying that led to the events that took place there. The drivers were responsible for what happened in Marrakesh. And then since then, they've just been really, really unlucky with incidents and whatnot. That all revolve around other drivers. So there's little to be said against the team itself. The Techeetah element of that team.
Yeah, fair enough. And it also occurs to me we've had a fair amount of races where the practices have been impacted by weather or other factors. And as we saw in Brooklyn last year, that can play a real part when you're on the edge with getting your software dialed in and with a lot of the technical infractions that I begin to see people on social media complaining about a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be the case this weekend again as well, with thunderstorms forecast for Saturday when the race is taking place. So we could see that yet again, much to Mahindra's annoyance, I would say, because they reckon their car's pretty good in the dry, but not so much in the wet. I'm sure the likes of Venturi and HWA are very much looking forward to that, because we saw them going really, really strong in a soaking Hong Kong. But I would, they should be right up there. And, I mean, fans can get annoyed at this kind of thing because there's no consistency, with it. But I love it. I just think you can go into every weekend and not have a clue who's going to win.
Well, that is the best, and that's why people tune in and watch. You've mentioned Nissan, you mentioned Venturi. Who else are we looking at to perform well? Who do we have our eye on for this race?
Well, on Nissan, I'm looking forward to seeing Roland again, because he proved in Hong Kong that his performance in Mexico City was not a one-off. Time to consolidate that position he's got. See if he can actually maintain pace over Sebastian Buemi, which would be quite an astounding thing. if he can. This weekend, I'm also keeping a very clear eye on Sam Bird, Jerome D'Ambrosio, Pascal Wehrlein, Antonio Felix Costa, and Lucas Di Grassi, because they seem like the most likely to move forward into championship contention. We've got to start thinking about this now, because we're basically at this race going to be at the halfway point of the season, 6 out of 13. And at the moment, there's so little covering so many drivers that at some point, some of them are going to start to break away, especially if they start to get a little bit of momentum and develop that consistency that everyone's been lacking so far, that we saw Jev have last season, that won him the title. And if one of these guys has a bad weekend here and somebody else has a great one, you're going to lose so much in the championship because of that. So there's still quite a lot at stake here, and we're going to start to see the championship pick off contenders one by one as we get onto that. So at the moment, you're going to start to look at, although they've been very quick, Nissan Edams for championship contention, they're about to get plucked off. Techeetah probably going to follow suit with that as well. Wehrlein, if he's not careful, is going to fall into that as well. Now, you can't blame him so much, really. He's had a stellar time in the short amount of time he's been in Formula E, and the first 2 races couldn't say anything against him because he wasn't at that first race, and he got taken out at turn 1 in Marrakesh. So we're going to start to see a few people start to fall apart now, and maybe in a couple of races we'll start to see them try something big and impressive to try and turn the championship around.
Okay, fair enough. So if I'm understanding you correctly, what we really need to be looking for is not even necessarily who wins this weekend, but who of the contenders is starting to have the least bad weekend race after race, because that's where the difference is going to come from.
I've always maintained that championships are rarely defined by your highest moments. They are determined by how low your lowest moments are. If your lowest moment is higher than a lot of people's averages, then you're on your way to championship success. And that's what Jev did so masterfully last season. But because of the craziness with the new car, the way it's shaken up the order, how competitive the field is, and the state of the racing we've seen, and throwing in attack mode into that as well, with the way it's mixed up the racing, we've just seen so many people get it right so few times and get it wrong quite a lot of times. And I will say, a lot of guys have had a lot of bad luck as well. But this, like I said, there's 11 points covering the top 6 in the championship. There's just so little to go off of.
Yeah, so if that continues, then we're expecting a down to the wire performance amongst those who can keep at the sharp end.
I was almost worried that the opposite would happen, as can often be the case, with these things, because if it's so hard to maintain consistency, if you're the one guy who does that, you're going to wrap up the championship with, a race, 2 races to spare. But the fact that nobody has seemed to be able to do that is quite encouraging for a exciting finale. And I do hope we manage to get to that. But what I'm sure of is that after this race, because the teams will, for the first time this season, get their cars back at the factory as well. Now, I'll be fascinated to see, in between Sanya and Rome, what the teams are able to find, to achieve. Because we've seen, say, Buemi, for example, in season 2, when they got the car back to the factory after the flyaway races, they suddenly found a bunch of sand in his brake ducts and his discs from Punta del Este. That's why he had so many issues in qualifying. Venturi, between the flyaways and the European season, suddenly got a massive upgrade on their simulator, and suddenly we see them competing for top 5s in races. We have so far to go, I think. And there's going to be more surprises yet. This one race, we may see, I don't know, a team start to gather it up, but then European season comes along, somebody else will find something.
Okay, well, let's take a minute and talk about Mahindra. You said they were fairly sure that their pace differential was weather dependent. So do we have any other information about that? And if they're aware of that, Why is it are they feeling that there's not much to be done about it? I mean, what is going on there? Do tell.
I think it was it was something they discovered in Hong Kong. And maybe with a bit of experience in Addiria as well, although it did look competitive in qualifying there. But it was more something they found in Hong Kong, I think. I don't think there's not anything to be done about it. It's just the way they have their car set up at the moment works very well in the dry, doesn't work so well in the wet. Do they want to compromise that setup, their base setup? Probably not. I mean, we're going to have to see how the weekend pans out, because it could well be that, we have a dry race again, because even the start of the Hong Kong race was only kind of mildly damp. I wouldn't call it a wet race. If that was a Formula One race, they'd have probably started on slicks. So there's that to take into account. We'll see how they go this weekend. It could well be that, so this track suits them a lot better, although it does look quite similar to Hong Kong, I must say. So getting the punch out of those hairpins is going to be particularly important. But we'll see. It's that we still don't know. We can make all these predictions all we want, but then they could just go off and score a 1-2, which is entirely plausible.
And would be utterly delightful, because it would just mess everything up all over again. Speaking of messing up, and I don't necessarily want to go all the way there, but I do notice that you've barely mentioned Mitch Evans or Jaguar all season long. Are they in a funk? Do we know what's going on there? Has it really just been bad luck for them all the way around, or is it something more at play?
No, it's not been bad luck. That car is simply not as good as his rivals. I mean, it's staggering at the moment that they're looking at 7th place in the championship. And I suppose you can look at that and say, well, someone's got to be 7th, especially when you've got 5, 6, 7 other teams that are performing so well. But Nelson's still having issues with the car that are beyond tire related now, because he's always referred to the Gen 2 Michelin tire as something he hasn't gotten on with very well. Now we're on that 3rd generation Michelin tire, and he said he much prefers it, but there's now something else that that they've got to get on top of. And Mitch said on Autosport that he think the Jaguar is a second a lap slower than the leaders, and I can't imagine there's too much powertrain related for that to be the case, because they're also similarly designed now. Maybe it's something to do with the packaging of it. It hasn't been done quite as well. The center of gravity is maybe a little bit higher, and they haven't quite got the lightest components in the world, although that was something they were quite proud of, how they managed to save weight over the course of last season for this season. So it's probably something more in the setup. We knew when the Gen 2 car arrived that it was going to catch a few teams out, because it's a whole new car you've got to learn, and you've got to know what a slight setup change anywhere on the car is going to do. And it just seems like Jaguar haven't quite unlocked that potential. I'm sure they will at some point, but at the moment it just hasn't been the case.
Okay, well, thank you for anticipating my question. If it was cooling and powertrain related, or regeneration related, or brake-by-wire related, because it seems like any one of those things could account for that kind of a difference. And I guess the question really is, like you say, when are they going to figure it out and unlock it?
Well, they've had 3 in-season test days to work around it, and we've seen Venturi turn things around in that amount of time. So why can't one of the largest OEMs on the planet do so? That is the big question on everyone's mind. We don't really have the full answers to that, unfortunately. I mean, probably, there are issues in the braking systems as well with the brake software, because I cannot imagine that there are teams that still aren't squabbling with that in a way and still getting their head around it. It may not account for so much pace in qualifying, but I think in the race that probably does have a bit of an impact. And the race is where you start, I mean, it's all well and good, so many of these guys covered by a second in qualifying, like first down to 15th, but it's the race where you start to see the expansion of the grid, because that's where the efficiency comes into play. I mean, not in the last couple of races, but when it does, you do start to see that the field spread a little bit more.
Yeah, fair enough. And for me, I always like to think that at moments like this, when you say, why can't Team X optimize thing Y after multiple opportunities, I think that almost always comes down to budget. Either budget or a fundamental design flaw that is not going to be fixed for a whole season. It's going to be one or the other.
I can't imagine it's the former.
Yeah, well, I don't know their finances, and just because they're a manufacturer doesn't mean they're going to heap unlimited amounts of money at it.
That's pretty good, I think, from what I hear. It's pretty good money.
Yeah, so then you start to think maybe it's something fundamental to how they turned up, and it's not going to be something they're going to easily fix without a fair amount of time. Let's go ahead. You talked about Venturi and getting the job done and improving. What are the odds that they're going to be able to maintain this level of performance?
I'll be fascinated to find out. I mean, they admitted that luck played a role in Hong Kong. I don't think anyone can deny that, really, because the conditions played into their hands in qualifying. It was tough to overtake. They were able to kind of maintain that pace. And then obviously everything that happened with Bird and Lotterer up the front. So what's going to happen now? You can't just call it a one-off, though, because they had a podium in Mexico City. Again, a couple of mitigating circumstances. But then in Santiago, they were fourth with Eduardo Mortara. And he's been the one, scoring all the big results. So where do they lie now? I could think of some circumstance for each of those races, though. Like in Santiago, it was blisteringly hot. You didn't have the BMWs up there. You didn't have the Chichitas up there. You didn't have D'Ambrosio up there either. So there were quite a few guys out of contention in that one. It was the same in Hong Kong. And it was not so much in Mexico City. That one was a clever tactic. But I would be fascinated to see how they go on just a normal, smooth, clear weekend, And we don't get too many of those in Formula E, so I don't think we're ever going to find out. But I hope it's a dry race, because otherwise it's just going to linger the question in the air for even longer. But there's certainly a team I'm keeping an eye on, because by all accounts, they should still be right up, maybe not fighting for the podium, but they can very easily, if they maintain this level of performance, get those top fives. And they can pick up, they're in such a great position where they can just pick off anyone who underperforms, like a shark lurking, circling you. If you screw up, we're coming to get you.
Yeah, and along those lines, what was I going to ask? I don't know. Sometimes my head just goes. I had something, and then you distracted me with all of your facts and figures. This hardly seems fair, because I'm old and feeble, and you are like so young and fresh over there on the other side of the pond. But with regards to their performance and their improvement, they do seem to be very clever with how they approach things, and very not just efficient on track, but efficient in their operations and in their strategy. So are they sort of a dark horse in that sense, in the sense that you think their rivals might underestimate them? And by talking long enough, it has also come back to me. We've been talking a lot about the drivers and the drivers' championship, but I also have a passing interest in the team results as well. Where are we in the team results? And do we see a difference, in your view, between teams that are more likely to win the championship versus individual drivers? Because it has been sort of a lot of teams have had hot and cold drivers and not putting both people in the points kind of near each other.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think we have the same thing going on this season. I'd say the two teams with the two strongest lineups so far this season has been Virgin with Bird and Fraintz, because Fraintz has actually been somewhat consistent this season. And the results haven't always been there, but he's had 2 podiums now. And he just needs to chip away that little bit extra that's going to give him, a win at some point. I'll be surprised if he doesn't win a race this season, because we know the car's capable of it. But then it's all about just getting that opportunity. If there are 15 guys that can win a race and you've only got 13 races, a few people are going to end up disappointed. So the other team I would put with that is Mahindra, because they have Pascal Verlaine, who is just sensational, and D'Ambrosio, who's been there since day one, and he has proved this season that he is no slouch. I mean, so many people when he was at Dragon were questioning him, like, his pace nowhere, why is he even on the grid? And he has proved otherwise this season. So they are the two I would consider the strongest candidates for a team's championship, because you've got, Techeetah have got an incredible lineup, but they've had so much bad luck, and BMW should be right up there, but Sims again has had so much bad luck that he is not anywhere near the championship position he deserves to be. So Antonio is really kind of pulling the weight in terms of the points in that championship. Audi should be up there, but Daniel's just still struggling compared to Lucas a little bit. And Venturi, I don't think have fun. I'm yet to believe that car is fundamentally as quick as like the BMWs and the Mahindras and the Audis. I hope I'm proven wrong, because that would be awesome. But then, you always think Felipe Massa is not quite on Edo's pace either, and nor would you expect him to be, because it's his first season, and Edo has got a year under his belt as well, and a lot more experience with the car, as much as Felipe's, been preparing for this since May last year. So no amount of preparation is going to prepare you for the actual thing. And I will say he's been a little bit unlucky as well, but he should have a few more points than he's actually scored. But in terms of the team's titles, Virgin and Mahindra are kind of my two favorites, because they've both done really, really well with the car, haven't had all that much bad luck comparatively. Both their drivers have been scoring big.
There are those who would say that Massa may not be quite as quick as he was in his heyday.
Yeah, that's probably the case. I mean, he's in his late 30s now. You would be hard pressed to find a driver who was as quick coming up to their 40s as they were when they were 25. Yeah, I mean, back then, when he was teammates with Michael Schumacher, and he could beat Schumacher, on his day. There probably is an argument to say the level of competition is so extreme that, a minor issue then costs you so much. And there is a case for that. But, Felipe is adapting. He is great to have in the team, because he's a strong developmental driver as well. He'll steer that car in the right direction, figuratively and literally. So, when I knew that Mauro Engel wasn't going to be on the grid, for example, who was the other driver in that team last season, I was disappointed, because he was a good driver. In my opinion, he was the stronger driver of the two, because he was the one more consistently scoring points. I mean, Edo scored, the podium in Hong Kong and then didn't score points for the rest of the season. So I was quite surprised by that. But, there's little to say that they can't achieve the same amount with this lineup.
Fair enough. What say we go find out some questions that our viewers had? So our first question is from Sam Harper, I assume from the Slack chat, and he wants to know, do they ship, and by they I assume he means the Formula E teams, everything home and back, or just keep it there, seeing as Sanya is fairly close to Hong Kong? And then he would like to know how they store it as when there's larger gaps between the races.
Yeah, so this is Sam from the Slack chat, and I messaged him as well to say that is an excellent question, because it's probably not as interesting an answer as you were hoping for, but obviously, as I mentioned earlier, between Adderia and after this race, they haven't gone back to the factory at all. They spend most of the time in between races in transit, to be honest, because Formula E is always looking for ways to reduce its carbon footprint, and that extends to transport as well. And DHL is responsible for all of that. So they're always trying to find ways of, so they won't take cargo planes, for example, as some series might do. With that, it adds a little bit of time to the transit process as well. So for this race, for example, you've had 2 weeks in between Hong Kong and Sanya. The vast majority of that will have been spent in transit. The bigger gaps, so the biggest one we had this season was between Adderia and Marrakesh. When they weren't in transit, they would have been in DHL warehouses up until they needed to be moved to the venue. And so you'll find all sorts of things get stored in DHL warehouses. There's probably some Formula One cars in there from time to time when there's a back-to-back weekend or something. If they're not at a street track, that is. So like Baku, for example. I don't know. That's speculation on my part. But so the difference after this race is that they'll actually take the cars back to the factory for the first time. I'm not sure how much they'll do that in between the races after that. It might depend on where you're based. So, for example, Venturi in Monaco, they can just drive the cars around the corner because that's where they're based.
Yeah, well, that's pretty convenient for them, but it must be a bit of an advantage to get the cars, as you mentioned earlier, back to the factory, have them properly apart, and maybe be able to tweak some things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to on the road.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as many times as you can take apart the car and check everything is the better, because not least for the examples I mentioned earlier with Buemi. The earlier you spot something, the better.
Indeed. Mr. B would like to know, should Formula E be positioning itself as a top-tier alternative to F1 for drivers, or would it be better placed as a gap between F2 and F1? That's kind of an intriguing question to me, not least because it presupposes that they have that level of control over how they are perceived by the wider motorsports community and drivers in particular.
Well, marketing is everything, isn't it? And how you market yourself is everything. This is another one from the Slack, actually. And if you're not in the Slack channel, then become a Patreon of Mr. Apex Podcast and join the hashtag Formula E in there. We do have a lot of good discussions in there. So this is a very heavy question, I feel. My basic answer to that is kind of yes and kind of no. That's about as simply as I can put it, because there was a follow-up to that as well. The gap, putting it in as a gap between F2 and F1. Formula E is not a feeder for F1. It never will be. It just can't be. It's too different. It's even so different from F2. It's so different from any motorsport. And the follow-up, this actually sparked a little bit of a conversation in the Slack, because they were saying, well, it's Formula 3 pace, so maybe it should be a sideways transition from that. And I don't really think it's anything to do with the pace of the cars, because it's such a technically demanding series. And the level you will find in that is as high as Formula One of the World Endurance Championship, for example. As an alternative to F1, I'd hate to say that Formula E is the kind of series that people look at and go, well, I can't make it into F1, I may as well go into Formula E, because there are drivers who actually want to be in Formula E. And it makes sense because there's so much manufacturer involvement. You're set for life, basically, or, about as much as a non-F1 driver can be, because racing drivers have got to think long term, because there are so many that won't get into F1 There's only 20 spots available. So you've got to think of an alternative career path. And I know using the same words as was in the question is kind of steering me to agree with that. In a way, I do, but I don't want it to, I don't want Formula E to be seen as kind of the reject pile, because there are more factors than just raw speed and raw talent and ability that go into deciding who makes it onto the F1 grid. I'm sure we're all aware of that, because you can very easily sit there and give the argument that the Formula E field is just as strong, if maybe ever so slightly behind, just because it's Formula One, the ability of that series. At worst, I would give it the second best field in motorsport. So it's hardly full of rejects and amateurs and people who don't know what they're doing. But if you line yourself with Formula E, there is a really strong chance you'll get in with a manufacturer. I mean, look at Stoffel van Dorn, who, after being discarded by McLaren, is now looking at a Mercedes Works drive for next season. That is how you get yourself set up. Neil Yarni, you wanted this mentioned in the show. I'm giving it to you, Matt. Neil Yarni is quitting the World Endurance Championship to focus on his Porsche Formula E career now. He's already been a Porsche Works driver, and it makes sense for him, driving a Rebellion in LMP1 that's never, ever going to win a race because Toyota are winning everything, and they're just getting increasingly frustrated with the fact that the privateers can't take it to Toyota. Take it to Formula E, where you are going to get a chance at winning races. Probably not straight away, but it'll come. It's Porsche. They're bound to get up to the front. So I've been talking for a while about it. I'm still not sure I've actually come to kind of any tangible conclusion to the question. But it pretty much is an alternative to Formula One, because every racing driver is going to want to make it into Formula One. But that's not to say that if they do end up in Formula E, they're no less and they're no worse, and they're certainly not worse off than if they made it into Formula One.
Well, I would say this. I would tend to agree with you, shockingly, but for this very simple reason. If you look at who's in the field right now, Sam Bird, Buemi, Van Dorn, Massa, if you look at all of the drivers, Frains, doesn't matter. They're all very experienced drivers. So the level of competition between the drivers is very, very mature. You're not going to, just based on speeds, see it be a sideways move for anyone in F3, because there's, with very few exceptions, not going to be many F3 drivers with the maturity to compete at that level. Yeah, that's why they go from F3 to F2. And I know there are some drivers who went directly from F3 to F1, but I think we could easily agree those tend to be the exceptions and not the rules.
So Maxi Gunter, for example, moving from F2 to FE, Felipe Massa probably would have argued that that was the wrong move for him, because he certainly was very critical of Gunter's driving in Santiago. And, as we can see, he's not in the car anymore, supposedly, as much as that was the pre-season plan. But there were a few you could argue are not as attuned in the racecraft that probably aren't around anymore, but certainly earlier in this series' development, where there was a lack of drivers maybe, and decisions were being made a little bit more commercially than anything else, you would definitely see that. Now, no way.
I have no idea who you're talking about. None at all. But I'm going to go on and say that if you really want to drive Formula One and you're done with Formula 2, then Super Formula is where you are, because they have downforce and speed and a lot of the same tracks. And the other difference, and I think this, to me, this drives the larger difference, is there are no tracks except for, I suppose, Mexico, and maybe some of the ones that have partial permanent circuits built into them, where you're going to see the same levels of runoff. It's the tracks are incredibly tight. The driving style being called for is quite different, And the racecraft of the people who are winning is incredibly, incredibly high. You're not going to see, as we saw, for example, Giovinazzi in Australia. It's going to be rare to see someone falling for a dummy like that. You're going to have to be more creative and clever and really put the pressure on if you want to get by.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, second strongest field in motorsport at worst. And that is by no means an insult, because there's a lot of motorsport out there, and there are some with fields where you do kind of just look at them and think, man, that's kind of the best you've got right now, and that's a little sad. And maybe it formerly used to have drivers where you'd think like that. That actually, no, it definitely did, but you don't anymore, and that's the element of it. And I think the standard is only going to get higher and higher.
Yep, I completely agree. Noel Nagy would like to know if Buemi can make a comeback a la Degrassi last year. And if he can't, if he does not get the better of his teammate, do you think he will stick around for another season?
Yes. Yes, I think regardless, he will stick around, because he knows that this Nissan thing wasn't going to light up like that. It was always going to be, a year or so of development, and it is actually coming along really, really well. That car is quick, and they just haven't quite got things there just yet. Do I think he's going to be able to get in the? I don't think he's in the title hunt. The Audi last season was by far the fastest car, and its performance in the race was unbelievable. That really, that was the car that should have won the title, because it was that much quicker. But I don't see that with the Nissan, because with Audi, it was a reliability thing, right? With Nissan, you could class it as reliability, I guess, because there's been, software issues that have taken them out of the race. There's been suspension issues that have taken them out of the race. There has been the miscalculation that took them out of the race. That isn't so much reliability, but you see that element of it, but I don't see the same kind of pace in the Nissan that I saw in the Audi last season. So I don't necessarily see, him coming back and fighting for second in the championship or whatever, but definitely, they'll probably win a race this season. I think that what's going to sting more is the fact that Ollie is beating him, because Buemi was the qualifying king, and his teammate, his former teammate, Nico Prost, was just nowhere near him. I mean, he would be a second off him at times. He has the record for the largest, qualifying margin, and it was to second place his teammate, which was something like 9.5 tenths of a second or something at the end of season 2. So, he's had it all his own way for 4 years, and suddenly Ollie's come in, done no testing effectively, taken 3 races, and is suddenly quicker than him. That is probably what's caught him by surprise more, and he's been helping him do it as well. So he might start, closing off a few channels there, because he obviously wants to be the number one. And I think, if Ollie's being it, that's not Seb underperforming, I think, because we know he's so damn fast. I mean, this is the record holder in Formula E of many of them. And you look at his World Endurance Championship performances, he's so good in everything. So for Ollie to be not only maintaining that level, but then exceeding it, that's just more about him, in my opinion.
Fair enough. And I do think any driver at Buemi's level, suffering a year where your teammate appears to be doing better than you, isn't going to run away from that.
No.
He thinks he knows he's that good, and he will be convinced that he can get on top of this situation. So yeah, that what you're saying makes sense to me.
I mean, Seb's going to give him the fight back for it. He's got to, and that is going to be one of the hottest battles in this championship.
Ah, yeah. Bring out the popcorn for that one. Korku Anoma would like to know why Sanya? Why not back to Beijing, for example, or some other city in China? Was there something about this location in particular that attracted the organizers?
It's particularly awesome. Formerly likes going to new locations. I don't blame them for mixing things up a little bit. You'd also have to consider the Beijing circuit was not amazing, in all honesty. It wasn't great to watch. It wasn't particularly great to drive, I don't think. It was straight chicane, straight chicane, straight chicane. We moved on from that. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't good to watch, and the location I don't think was particularly popular either. So, I mean, yeah, fair play for Formula E for trying something new. We always know they're venturing into the new locations. I mean, there were plenty of reasons why Beijing was pulled. So going to Sanya was a great option, really.
All right, then. And along the way, I don't know, it doesn't say who asked this question, but clearly this is a question that's out there, and you have sort of touched on it, I think. But what exactly has been going on at Venturi? Is it just that they have a new team principal? Is it the involvement of HWA and Mercedes? Is there a little extra cash there now? What do you think is going on? I mean, I know I talked with some Venturi team people last summer, and they definitely seem to have their own way of doing things, but also a clever way of doing things, if I at risk of repeating myself.
Yeah, I don't think so the turnaround is probably like more relating to this season because they started it so weak, and I know they ended last season regularly competing for top 5 finishes. So, and that's about where they're back to at the moment, in all honesty. But because they started the season so poorly and it was not really reliable in testing, they kept having performance issues and reliability issues on all 4 cars, the Venturis and the HWAs. Frankly, I'm surprised by that, given the amount of testing that they would have had prior to the season. More than the other teams, because you get an extra 7 days if you're running a customer, and they gave all of them to HWA, but that's still all the data they're getting back as well. And every single race they've got another 2 cars running their powertrain to get data off of. So it does surprise me that it took quite so long for this to sort of come around. But the real thing has been the in-season test. We've gone from having 1 in-season test day to 3, and Susie has said that this has been absolutely crucial for us because testing is so limited. So any extra day you get is worth so much, and particularly on days where you don't learn anything in an E-Prix. So at Diriyah was the prime example, where you went from having just you learned nothing from that race. They learned everything on the test day. That for me has been the bigger turnaround for them, because of course you can't change anything on the car itself because it's all homologated for the season. So it is more down to the operations and the setup of the car, and particularly the braking software as well has been a big breakthrough moment, because it was just the first thing they identified as a problem in that car. Efficiency just wasn't there. Now it's one of the most efficient cars.
Yeah, I was going to bring up software because that always seems to be an area where teams can achieve additional optimization of whatever parameters they're keying on.
Yeah, this is what Buemi said, where it's like software updates in Formula E are the equivalent of aerodynamic updates in Formula One, because you come to every race with something, and sometimes you bring up something big, and it is the development area on these cars.
All right, well, that actually is fascinating, and I'm glad you shared that quote. Let's talk about Nio for a second, and Dragon. Nio. Now, I was watching Grand Tour because I could, quite frankly. My family had gone to bed, And they were testing the new Nio track-only electric hypercar. But I've also heard that their plans, their big factory plans in the United States, have fallen through. What is going on with them? What is their status? And do we expect improvement from them?
I don't think I'm the best person to ask in terms of, you know, the wider Nio brand, the Nio, the car manufacturer, Nio, the Formula E team. I'll tell you all about, because the question that we got specifically was, is there any hope for Nio and Dragon? And that, I mean, that is a fair question, because they're not only the tail enders in this season, but Dragon have been the tail enders for a good while now. Nio has been a tail ender, sort of slightly worked up, and then there's sort of slipped back down again. And even then, their best result is only a podium. Since they took over the team from Team China Racing. Obviously, that team won the championship, but it's just not the same outfit anymore, in any shape whatsoever. So there's reason to be concerned about that. For Nio, I have more optimism than I do for Dragon, but not a huge amount for either. Just because I haven't seen an awful lot from Nio to suggest that it can build a car that can beat an Audi or a DS or a Mahindra or a BMW. You know, you got to think of the caliber they're going up against, and they're a relatively small manufacturer, and it is hard. But you see Mahindra do it, and they're also a relatively small manufacturer. So there is a hope there in that regard. In terms of what I've seen from the team, there's little to suggest that's coming. But then they have just had a kind of complete design overhaul of their car, changing concept after three seasons. So give them time, and we'll see what next season brings. I feel like the extra technical know-how needed on the cars now maybe isn't helping, although we know the people in the team are no slouches. Jerry's put together an amazing team there. You got to wonder if this is an issue of resource as well, which is more likely, because then that impacts the bigger areas, the braking software and software in general, as we've been talking about. So that's the key area for them. For Dragon, I don't see much for the future unless they can tie in with some manufacturer, because they've been at the back now for 3-4 years with no sign of things changing, of things improving. If you were to ask me what's the next Formula E team to drop out, I don't think this is incredibly likely, or very likely at all. But if you were to ask me which of those teams is the most likely to drop off the radar, it's Dragon. Not that they're like the Williams of Formula E, but they're the ones consistently at the back. And where are the improvements coming from? Where is the plan for the future? There isn't one.
Okay, there isn't one. I mean, do you get the sense, as I sometimes do, that they're just kind of keeping their foot in and maybe waiting for that next manufacturer deal to come along and want a space that they happen to have?
They had that opportunity at the beginning of last season and threw it away. So yeah, there's obviously a lot going on behind closed doors that we're not very privy to, but I have to wonder, if they didn't want Porsche, who are they going to want? The standard isn't going to get much higher than that. So yeah, what are they looking for? Big question.
Well, maybe a manufacturer that will meet them on their own terms. And there are other manufacturers making commercial electric vehicles that are not yet involved. And I assume there's only a limited number of spots available.
I think it'd be hard pressed to find many manufacturers who will meet their requirements.
Fair enough then. Any other business for you then?
I don't think so much beyond the plugging. It's our favorite part of the show.
Indeed. Well, by all means, you first.
Oh, thank you. Well, follow me on Twitter at Chris on Racing. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Missed Apex podcast did our Simply Race live event at Milton Keynes. So you can go and watch the stream back on their channel, or we're going to be releasing the individual races on the Missed Apex YouTube channel, which I would recommend that you go and watch, because there was some very spicy racing up at the front of that.
Yes, there was many a controversy, some of which involved Brad and his lane system. So highly recommended. I don't want to spoil it beyond that, but anyway. As for me, of course, I'm at MattPT55 on the Twitters, and I'm going to say go buy my wife's book, The One I Love to Hate, the talented and amazing at A Weaver Writes on Twitter, or Amanda Weaver if you're searching on Amazon. It just released yesterday. And yeah, if you have a hankering to read anything of the sort, and it is a good book on its own merits. It's not just a tropey romance. It's an actually good story, and her dialogue is amongst the best in the genre, if I do say so myself, possibly slightly biased there. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at eRadioShow. And if you are part of our Missed Apex Slack group, be sure to join the Formula E channel as well. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.